Tonight at 10, the official verdict on Britain's involvement in the Iraq War, 13 years after the invasion happened. The decision to invade was made on the basis of unreliable intelligence and before all the peaceful options were explored, according to Sir John Chilcot.
The UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort.
179 British service personnel died in the conflict. Today, the families expressed their dismay and, in some cases, their deep anger.
There is one terrorist in this world that the world needs to be aware of, and his name is Tony Blair, the world's worst terrorist.
But Tony Blair defended the decision to invade while acknowledging that mistakes were made at that time and regretting the loss of life.
I express more sorrow, regret, and apology than you may ever know or can believe. I can look not just the families of this country, but the nation in the eye and say, I did not mislead this country. I made the decision in good faith on the information I had at the time.
We'll have reaction from politicians, the forces families, and from the Middle East. Also tonight, disappointment for thousands of Welsh fans, but pride at the team's record achievement in a major competition. And at Wimbledon, Andy Murray is through to the semi-final after a 5-set tussle.
Coming up later in the hour on BBC News, we'll have a detailed look at the semi.
Good evening. 13 years after the invasion of Iraq, the Chilcot report has delivered a searing verdict on Britain's involvement and the way in which Tony Blair's government made the decision to take part. Mr. Blair has expressed deep regret for the loss of life, but insisted the decision to invade was the right one. The inquiry concluded that military action was not the last resort in 2003. It said the decision to invade was based on flawed intelligence. It said the planning for the war and for Iraq's future was wholly inadequate. And it said the military operation ended a long way from success with far-reaching consequences. Tonight we'll have reaction from politicians, from families and from the Middle East. But first tonight, our political editor Laura Koonsberg reports on the Chilcot findings.
Are you expecting criticism today, Mr. Blair?
Those who led us in. Those who loved and lost.
Good morning, Sir John. Good morning. How are you feeling today?
And the man who took longer than the Iraq War itself to judge what really went wrong. Then, not a sound in the Westminster Conference Centre, where the Chilcot evidence was heard and where the families waited for a final few seconds for the verdict that's taken 7 years.
We have concluded that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort.
Polite, but clear and devastating.
The judgments about the severity of the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMD, were presented with a certainty that was not justified. Despite explicit warnings, the consequences of the invasion were underestimated. The planning and preparations for Iraq after Saddam Hussein were wholly inadequate. The government failed to achieve its stated objectives.
He found no evidence of deceit, but simply the case for war was wrong. The report says it's now clear that policy on Iraq was made on the basis of flawed intelligence and assessments. They were not challenged, and they should have been. And he found a woeful lack of forethought for the British forces and Iraq's future. Despite promises that Cabinet would discuss the military contributions, it did not discuss the military options or their implications. Blair did not ensure there was a flexible, realistic and fully resourced plan. But were troops sent into an illegal war? Nowhere in the 2.5 million words of this report was a legal judgment made. It wasn't set up to do so. But the inquiry suggests the conflict might have broken the law.
The circumstances in which it was decided that there was a legal basis for UK military action were far from satisfactory.
Blair lied! Blair lied!
But there was rage outside. Some anger will never be abated. And the report catalogued the growing determination of Tony Blair and George Bush to take on Saddam Hussein. At the Bush Ranch in 2002, a strategy for a UN ultimatum, or Saddam would face the consequences. A couple of months later, in a previously unseen note, Blair wrote, "I'll be with you, whatever," still urging him to employ the UN. But by September, flawed intelligence led to this claim.
Which could be activated within 45 minutes.
But his determination was stronger than diplomacy. By mid-March, the talking was over. The war had begun.
Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea. Their mission? To remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq.
A rapid toppling of the regime that quickly turned to failure. Hopes of an easy transition that turned to dust. British forces without the basics they'd needed humiliated, the inquiry claims. But Tony Blair, who made the decisions, was full of sorrow and regret, but still thinks he was right.
The decision to go to war in Iraq and to remove Saddam Hussein from power in a coalition of over 40 countries led by the United States of America was the hardest, most momentous, most agonizing decision I took in my 10 years as British Prime Minister. For that decision today, I accept full responsibility. Without exception and without excuse. The intelligence assessments made at the time of going to war turned out to be wrong. The aftermath turned out to be more hostile, protracted and bloody than ever we imagined. The coalition planned for one set of ground facts and encountered another. And a nation whose people we wanted to set free and secure from the evil of Saddam became instead victim to sectarian terrorism. For all of this, I express more sorrow, regret, and apology than you may ever know or can believe. There were no lies, there was no deceit, there was no deception, but there was a decision. And it was a controversial decision. A decision to remove Saddam and a decision to be with America. Because the point about being Prime Minister is you're the decision maker. You sit in the seat and take the decision. And your obligation to the country is to take it as you believe it to be.
But this report is a devastating catalogue of the failures of your government and paints a very clear picture of a Prime Minister who was determined to act with the United States, almost come what may. Do you understand the sentiments of some of the families who believe you ought not just to have said sorry a long time ago, but that now you should face some kind of punishment?
It's true. I took the decision after 9/11 we should be America's closest ally. Again, you can disagree with that. You know, in the end, what more can I do than say to people, this is why I took the decision I did, and if you disagree with me, fine, but please stop saying I was lying or, you know, I had some sort of dishonest or underhand motive. I had the motives I explained.
Blair lied! Thousands died! Blair lied! Millions died!
Some moments of decision, moments of protest, barely last. Some stir anger and anguish and will never be forgotten. The Iraq inquiry may suggest once and for all this was never mission accomplished. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, Sir John Chilcot said that plans for any future military intervention should be calculated, debated and challenged, in stark contrast to what happened back in 2003. Sir John's report runs to 2.5 million words and covers every aspect of the decision-making, the military operation and the aftermath. Nicholas Witchell has been looking in more detail.
Foreign policy objective.
For month after month, some of the most senior figures in the land, ministers, civil servants, military leaders and intelligence chiefs, came to give evidence. From their testimony and many thousands of documents, Sir John Chilcot has distilled his conclusions. It's on the use of intelligence that he offers some of his most forthright findings.
It is now clear that policy on Iraq was made on the basis of flawed intelligence and assessments. They were not challenged, and they should have been.
In the House of Commons on the 24th of September 2002, Mr Blair talked up the credibility of the intelligence he was being given.
It is extensive, detailed and authoritative.
According to Mr Blair, Saddam Hussein could activate his chemical and biological weapons within 45 minutes. None of this was correct.
The judgments about Iraq's capabilities in that statement and in the dossier published the same day were presented with a certainty that was not justified.
Not only was intelligence flawed, so too were the discussions about the legality of an invasion.
Hi, Mr Goldsmith. William from ITN.
The Attorney-General at the time was Lord Peter Goldsmith, but it's clear from the report that time and again the Cabinet was denied a chance to hear his detailed arguments. One such an occasion was a matter of weeks before the invasion began. And so to the chaos of post-invasion planning and another catalogue of failures. According to the report, Mr Blair's government was warned explicitly of the risk that an invasion would destabilise Iraq and lead to the growth of Al-Qaeda. And as British forces faced the growing Iraqi insurrection, the government failed to equip them properly.
We have found that the Ministry of Defence was slow in responding to the threat from improvised explosive devices, and that delays in providing adequate medium-weight protected patrol vehicles should not have been tolerated.
Britain's invasion of Iraq has been minutely scrutinised. Sir John Chilcot has found that it was an unwarranted invasion based on flawed intelligence with insufficient discussion and inadequate planning. It was an intervention which, he said, had caused anguish and suffering in Britain and in Iraq.
The evidence is there for all to see. It is an account of an intervention which went badly wrong, with consequences to this day.
Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, at the Iraq inquiry.
Well, the Chilcot report estimates that more than 150,000 people died in Iraq during the war and in the years that followed. There were 179 losses for the British Armed Forces. Many of the families had campaigned for an inquiry so that they could get some definitive answers about the path to war and the subsequent military campaign. Our special correspondent Fergal Keane reports now on the families' reaction to the Chilcot report.
The bereaved have endured 7 years of painful waiting and hoping for truth. Debbie Albert and her son Connor were on their way to hear Sir John Chilcot speak. Stephen Albert, husband and father, was killed in Iraq in 2003. In the last few days, the trauma has returned.
You know, it's brought a lot of memories back, so it's nightmares where Steve was still alive and I saw him in a shop, and they've just been horrible nightmares.
What do you want from this report?
But I'm just hoping that we find out, you know, why we went in and why we went in so quickly as well.
In his last letter to his children, Steve Albert wrote of how he loved them. "Sorry, I can't tell you when I'll be home," he said.
I think the pain's always going to be there. I think even when I'm 60 years old, you know, there's still always going to be pain there, because at the end of the day, I never had a childhood with my dad.
In the quiet of nearby Westminster Abbey, former SAS man John Brown was remembering his son Nick, also an SAS trooper. He wanted answers about the justification for going to war.
We want to know what the inquiry says about the entry, the reasons to go to war. That's where the key questions are. I know they never had an exit strategy.
The families were invited to meet Sir John Chilcot and read a summary of his report. The families came here looking for the truth, and a truth that named names and apportioned blame. Well, they've now had a chance to consider the report's main findings.
The families gathered here trust that we speak with honour and honesty on behalf of all other families of servicemen and women who died in the Second Iraq War.
The family said they'll study the conclusions and decide whether to launch legal action against Tony Blair. There were raw emotions.
I've gone back to that time when I learned that my brother had been killed. And there is one terrorist in this world that the world needs to be aware of, and his name is Tony Blair, the world's worst terrorist.
But there was a welcome for the report's findings from the families we met.
What's your reaction to what you heard?
I'm amazed. I didn't expect it to be, as good an outcome really. I thought we'd have a bit of a cover-up or something going on, but I think Sir John Chilcot's done us a good job, and I'm really, really pleased with the outcome.
It's good news, but I think at the same time it's bad news as well, because I think if Tony Blair wasn't the Prime Minister at the time, I think my dad could still be here today. So.
Some watched the proceedings unfold from home and did not feel comforted. Carol Jones' son John was killed when his snatched Land Rover was hit by a roadside bomb in Basra in 2005.
Blair said, "Bush, I'm with you all the way." Did he think about what he said when he said that? I'm with you all the way. Had he been and discussed this with his Parliament?
The former SAS man John Brown watched Tony Blair's response this afternoon.
For all of this, I express more sorrow, regret, and apology.
Tony Blair has just apologised. What does that mean to you? What do you think of that?
It's a joke. He's putting on an act here. He knows that he's up against the wall, really, when it comes to the Chilcot inquiry.
The Chilcot report hasn't given the families all the answers they sought, but it has restored some measure of their faith in British public life. Fergal Keane, BBC News.
Let's go live to the Ministry of Defence tonight now. Defence correspondent Jonathan Beale is there. Let's talk about the findings on the military, Jonathan. How tough, how critical are they?
Well, I think if there's any comfort in this report for the families, it is that it doesn't pull its punches in criticising the military top brass. They hadn't properly prepared for that invasion. They weren't prepared either for the violence that erupted, even though they'd been warned. They withdrew troops when they should have been thinking of reinforcements, just like the Americans. And then they switched limited resources to a second war in Afghanistan, just as things were going badly wrong in Afghanistan. I think the frustration for the families is over equipment, and particularly the snatched Land Rover vehicles. It's worth remembering these lightly armoured vehicles, 27 of the 179 British military personnel who died in Iraq were killed in these inadequate vehicles. And yet Sir John says he couldn't, after 7 years, identify an individual, not even a department inside the MOD, that was responsible for the delays in replacing them. He's also, at the end, identified a cultural problem within the military. That is their can-do spirit. Although it has many benefits, it prevented them from speaking truth to power. And when things went wrong, they simply didn't speak out.
Jonathan, again, thanks very much. Jonathan Beale there, our defence correspondent. Well, today's report concluded that intelligence reports were flawed in parts and based on fabricated evidence too. Sir John said evidence gathered had not established beyond doubt that Saddam Hussein had continued to produce chemical and biological weapons. Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera analyses what went so badly wrong.
Today's report made tough reading for Britain's spies, criticising the reliability of their intelligence and the way politicians put it to use. Failures which should never be repeated, according to the man who led the previous inquiry into weapons of mass destruction.
I think the mistake was to use intelligence as a means of persuasion of the United Nations, of our nation, to justify the war. And when you mix up political persuasion and intelligence, then that's very dangerous, because intelligence ought to be objective.
But was it objective? Released in the feverish atmosphere of September 2002, the government's dossier was central to its case for war. Spies had been desperately hunting for intelligence to put in it, and MI6 told ministers it had found a crucial new agent who had direct knowledge of chemical weapons production. He said they were stored in glass spheres looking just like this.
Really elegant string of pearls configuration, unfortunately incredibly unstable.
But the agent, it soon emerged, had based his reports on watching this Hollywood film. Real chemical weapons aren't stored this way. Other agents, like the one who talked of weapons that could be fired in 45 minutes, were also making it up.
Failing to spot fake intelligence was just one of the failures. The spies were also accused today of not challenging Tony Blair when he said their intelligence was beyond doubt, when the reality was far less conclusive.
And even as inspectors scoured Iraq and found nothing, the spies did not reassess their belief that weapons of mass destruction were there.
Everyone was very busy. The wheels of war were clearly turning, and the Joint Intelligence Committee had other priorities. But we can now see that perhaps we should have done that.
The intelligence failures were manifold and consequential, and today's inquiry say they left a damning legacy of mistrust. Gordon Carrera, BBC News.
Well, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who voted against the war in Iraq in 2003, apologised this afternoon on behalf of his party for what he called the disastrous decision to invade Iraq. Other Labour figures who were involved in the decision in government have been giving their response to the report's findings, as our deputy political editor John Pienaar tells us.
1 million and more demonstrated against the invasion, and Jeremy Corbyn was with them, and they've condemned it ever since. He never imagined then he'd be Labour leader, but he is, and today, finally, Mr Corbyn seized his moment.
Politicians and political parties can only grow stronger by acknowledging when they get it wrong and by facing up to their mistakes. So I now apologise sincerely on behalf of my party for the disastrous decision to go to war in Iraq.
No confessions of blame, though, from the decision-makers behind the invasion, although Jack Straw, Foreign Secretary then, admits better post-war planning might have avoided at least some of Iraq's post-war chaos.
So what do you say to the families of British servicemen, among others, who have lost loved ones as a result of the mistakes that were made, including by you?
Well, I say to them, I mean, first of all, that I grieve for them. They may say it's easy for Jack Straw to say that, but I do, and I have the deepest sympathy for those who lost loved ones. And I feel a great burden for that, and I should do. But I also...
Why do you feel a burden?
Why? Because I participated in decisions to put particularly young British men and women in the armed forces in harm's way, and some of them lost their lives or were maimed for life.
And no apology from Tony Blair's communications chief, who crafted the case for war. No need, according to Alastair Campbell.
There was no lying, there was no deceit, there was no sexing up of intelligence, there was no secret deal at Crawford with Bush. And what's more, I think that the processes, yes, they could have been improved, but ultimately it was about the decision. And he took the decision that he did in good faith, and he will, for the rest of his life, stand or fall by that.
The anti-war protesters won't forget or forgive. The Chilcot report hasn't settled arguments. Nothing could. John Pienaar, BBC News.
Well, the violence which erupted in Iraq in 2003 has continued to this day, as we know, and Sir John Chilcot in today's statement underlined the suffering of the Iraqi people, including 1 million of them forced from their homes. As our Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen reports now from Baghdad, the war sent shockwaves which are still being felt throughout the entire region.
The people of Baghdad and the rest of Iraq are still living and dying with the consequences of the 2003 invasion.
Security is being beefed up yet again after the bomb that killed 250 people on Sunday. But the fear of a sudden, random death is never far away. When the US forces reached Baghdad in April 2003, pictures of them helping Iraqis topple a statue of Saddam Hussein went round the world. Hadim al-Jabouri started knocking lumps out of the plinth to celebrate what he believed was liberation. Now, like many Iraqis, he's nostalgic for the brutal certainties of Saddam's time.
Saddam has gone, and we have 1,000 Saddams now.
If Tony Blair was here this morning, what would you say to him?
I would say to him, you are a criminal, and I'd spit in his face.
Less than an hour's drive from Baghdad, these are Iraqi Shia militiamen, trained and equipped by Iran, attacking Islamic State jihadists. Chilcot says the British government ignored a warning that removing Saddam would offer Iran an opening in Iraq. Captured IS positions seem to have been prepared by trained soldiers, not foreign volunteers. IS commanders include former Iraqi officers who joined the jihadists when the US and Britain dissolved the Iraqi army. Not all of the chaos, violence and war in the Middle East at the moment can be traced back to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, but an awful lot of it can. It was like throwing a great big rock into a pond. It sent out shockwaves, geopolitical, religiously sectarian, military, and 13 years later, they are still crashing around the region. Warnings about internal strife, regional instability and the rise of jihadists were also ignored by Number 10, says Chilcot. The warnings were accurate. Iraq's sectarian violence spread to Syria, Yemen and elsewhere as leaders used and abused Shia-Sunni fears to fight for power. Jihadists were on the attack before the invasion, but Iraq after 2003 offered al-Qaeda a haven and launch pad that Islamic State is still using.
So if Daesh have been walking through, for instance, a bit of water or a river, and then they're walking on...
Small numbers of British troops, filmed on condition they weren't identified, are back here training Iraqi soldiers to fight IS, known as Daesh. Their commander was in Basra in 2007.
We're not here in a combat role now. We're here at the invitation of the government of Iraq, and we're working very much hand in hand with the Iraqi security forces to help them in their defeat of Daesh.
At this base, Australians and New Zealanders outnumber the British. It's a long way from Basra and what Chilcot calls the humiliating end of an intervention that went badly wrong. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Baghdad.
Well, our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, is with me in the studio. John, when you consider all the major foreign policy decisions taken, let's say since the Second World War, where does this decision to invade Iraq fit in?
Well, I'm afraid it fits in with some of the very worst, Hugh. The decision to invade Egypt to try to keep control of the Suez Canal in 1956, which effectively brought British colonialism to a full stop. I would rate it also with the Soviet decision to invade Afghanistan at the end of 1979, from which the Soviet Union never properly recovered. I think America has suffered very, very heavily in its reputation as a result. And I think Britain's reputation has suffered simply because it's obvious that we played no serious part in the planning and organisation and the whole idea of the follow-through. British officials had some very clear ideas. They knew Iraq in a way the Americans didn't. Made no difference. There is one point, I think, which does have to be made, which is that Saddam Hussein was on a collision course with the West. He was bound to do something at some stage. But instead of allowing him to do that, as he had in 1990 when he invaded Kuwait, and really pretty much the whole world supported the Americans in liberating Kuwait, instead of that, the Americans went first, got in there first.
I suspect that, in fact, I know that the British and maybe the Americans too thought that they'd find weapons of mass destruction, so the whole thing would in fact be self-justifying. And of course they didn't.
John, again, thanks very much. John Simpson there for us, our World Affairs editor. Can I just remind you that the full details of the Chilcot report are available online. The address is bbc.co.uk/news, together with reaction and analysis from John and his colleagues following today's publication. Right, let's turn to some football then. And at Euro 2016, the remarkable run for the Wales team has ended tonight in Lyon, sadly, where they were beaten 2-0 by Portugal in the semi-finals. It's been the best ever Welsh performance in an international competition. There were certainly high hopes before the match that Wales would make it to the final, but it wasn't to be. Let's join our sports editor Dan Rowan, who's in Lyon tonight.
Well, Wales have upset the odds here in France in a way that's barely been believable. Chris Coleman's skillful and above all spirited side reaching the last four of this competition. The first time ever in the country's history they've managed to reach a semi-final of a major tournament. They were the form team coming into this game. They had all the momentum with 4 good wins going into tonight's game against Portugal, but sadly it proved a game too far and Britain has missed out on its first finalist in a major tournament since 1966.
We're in a place no Welsh team had ever been before. Now their fans urged them to go even further.
They couldn't have given any more, and I always say to them, if you've given everything you've got and you come up short, so what? That's it. Once you've given everything you got, that's it. And they gave what they had. It was just one too far for us tonight.
These Euros and captured sports imagination in a way few thought possible. Dan Rowan, BBC News, Lyon.
Well, not surprisingly, more than half the population of Wales, not to mention all those Welsh living outside Wales, were expected to be watching the match this evening, and tens of thousands of them watched the game at the Principality Stadium in Cardiff. My colleague Sian Lloyd was there.
The fans back home have savoured every second of Wales's journey, and on the streets of Cardiff, excitement was mounting.
Come on, Wales!
The home of Welsh rugby transformed into a football fan zone. 27,000 tickets were available. They were all snapped up in less than 2 hours.
The atmosphere is outstanding. There are people travelling far and wide to come here. It's just unbelievable.
Excited, nervous, just can't wait really.
Wales football is on the up now. All rugby fans are joining. We're all in.
Together stronger.
Yeah, come on, together stronger.
And they were together as they sang the national anthem in unison with the fans in France.
This atmosphere is electrifying, almost as though the game was being played here, let alone 730 miles away in Lyon.
Crowds gathered to watch across Wales, in the open air in Aberystwyth, and the beer was flowing in Caernarfon. The dreams started to fade. Cristiano Ronaldo breaking Welsh hearts, and within minutes the atmosphere sank again. Full time and the dream was over.
What we've done just to get to the semi-final at least is outstanding.
We've got this far to the semi-finals. Nobody expected that. It's been absolutely brilliant. So proud of the boys.
Wales's epic journey may have come to an end, but the enthusiasm of the fans has never wavered for a team they're proud of. Sian Lloyd, BBC News, Cardiff.
Let's go back to Lyon and talk to Dan, who's there, our sports editor. Dan, of course, there's been fantastic team spirit, and we've underlined that throughout the last few weeks. But were Portugal clearly the better team tonight, do you think?
Possibly, Hugh, yes. I mean, there was always a sneaking suspicion that Portugal's extra experience and know-how may prove decisive, and that came to pass. Certainly Cristiano Ronaldo winning his personal duel with his Real Madrid teammate Gareth Bale. No doubt the Welsh players will be sitting in the dressing room right now, just a few metres from me here, pitch side, devastated by that loss. But they've done their country proud. They will go home as winners. They've been a credit, really, to their nation. You have to remember just how far this country has come in football terms. They were ranked 117th in the world as recently as 2011. They had to wait 58 years until now to reach a major tournament. They almost reached the final of it. They're the smallest country in population terms ever to get this far in a major tournament. And I think above all, this team has demonstrated the importance of togetherness and team spirit. They've shown just how far that can get you. There's a lesson there, surely, for some other nations who underachieve on the international stage. We've seen Leicester City reverse the established order in the Premier League this season. Now Wales have done the same on the international stage. A lesson that sport still has an enduring ability to surprise and delight.
Indeed, Dan, a good message to end on. Thank you very much, Dan Rowan, there for us, our sports editor in Lyon. Right, let's have a brief look then at some of the day's other news stories. And the South African athlete Oscar Pistorius has been sentenced to 6 years in prison for murdering his girlfriend Reva Steenkamp. His previous conviction for manslaughter had been overturned on appeal. The pound has fallen further on the international currency markets. It dipped below $1.28 today for the first time since 1985, before recovering slightly. The FTSE 100 also lost ground as investors continue to react to the EU referendum result. The Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has announced that he will impose a new contract on junior doctors in England. A deal between the government and the British Medical Association was rejected by BMA members in a vote earlier this week. Mr Hunt said that by autumn of next year, most of the profession in England would be on the new deal. Well, it's been a pretty thrilling day at Wimbledon on centre court, with the 7-time champion Roger Federer coming back from 2 sets down against Marian Cilic. And Andy Murray was pushed all the way by Jo-Wilfried Tsonga, but held on to make it to the semi-finals. Joe Wilson was watching.
Centre court can fit in 15,000 and 10 sets of the most gripping tennis. Andy Murray and Jo-Wilfried Tsonga put on a display here which covered every inch and every emotion just in the first set. Murray won a tie-break without breaks. He never stopped. The second set was Murray's easily, but in the third he was still chasing and not always reaching. Tsonga won it 6-3. Murray missed chances in the fourth, lost that set, so now he had to summon himself, recover himself. Fifth set, 6-1. Thomas Burdick next for Murray after a deep breath.
I just tried to use all of my energy at the beginning of the fifth set to get myself up, try and get the crowd pumped up. It'd been a long day for them.
Well, Andy Murray was epic, but he was not everything, because earlier in the day the centre court crowd saw another of their great favourites pushed to the limit.
Thank you.
Roger Federer reserves his place on centre court with an immaculate blazer, but for 2 sets his elegance was overpowered by Marian Cilic in their quarter-final. 2 sets down, Federer defied 3 match points, came through a 20-point tie-break in the 4th set and finished the 5th like this.
Remarkable.
Well, good try, Cilic. This is still my court. Joe Wilson, BBC News, Wimbledon.
A quick reminder, Newsnight is underway on BBC Two with more analysis and interviews on the Chilcot inquiry. Here on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.